Good. All right, so we're going through cross sections and looking at lesions of cross sections in the brainstem that can affect function. The next one we're going to talk about is the midbrain anterior lesion. So this is a midbrain anterior lesion. Generally encompasses somewhere around this area here. It's due to blockages or damage to branches of the superior cerebellar artery. Okay, superior cerebellar artery. Deficits. Main deficits with this are going to be contralateral hemiparesis. So that's due to damage of the cortical spinal tracts that are running in that crus cerebri. So you see this is the crus cerebri here. So we've damaged a fairly significant portion of these cortical spinal tract fibers that are running down that are going to eventually go down to the medulla before they cross over, right? So this is going to be the lesions on the left in this case, hemiparesis on the right. And then the other thing with this is potentially is loss of eye movement because of cranial nerve number 3, okay? So this is cranial nerve number 3, fibers coming actually, these ones right here, but you can catch the edge of those cranial nerve fibers, both the sympathetic and the oculomotor nerve portions of that. They're all coming out the same nerve, but this is just showing you back here the Edinger-Westphal nucleus and the oculomotor nucleus here close together. But these are the fibers here of the oculomotor nerve and the parasympathetic division coming out. So you can block all the muscles innervated by the oculomotor nerve, which is everything but superior oblique and lateral rectus. And then also you could have some loss of, the eyelid being a little droopy and the pupil being a little dilated because you lose the parasympathetic constriction component of it. Okay, so. And then midbrain tegmental lesions. So remember the tegmentum is this kind of this whole middle region of the brainstem is the tegmentum, and then this is back here is the tectum back here, but that middle region is the tegmentum where you have reticular formation and all those kind of things. But in the midbrain we have some other structures in there as well. So again, with a midbrain tegmental lesion, which is typically due to a blockage of the posterior cerebellar artery, okay, there's branches off the posterior cerebellar artery that penetrate into this tegmental region of the midbrain. Oculomotor nerve, so this is that oculomotor nerve running through here, fibers that can get blocked by that. So again, the loss of eye movement. Contralateral loss of all sensation of face and body, okay, because you're impacting, this is everything together here. This is your medial lemniscus, right? The tip here, this is your spinal lemniscus right here. So you've got medial lemniscus, spinal lemniscus, and your trigeminal lemniscus sits right in this area here. So, and once you're up in this midbrain region, everything's crossed over by that point. Once you get up into that midbrain, because you're just about to get up into the internal capsule and up into the cerebrum, everything's together at that point. So if you have damage to all these sensory tract fibers on this left side, it's going to affect all the right-sided face and body. So this is an exception. Remember I said that, if you have a lesion in the midbrain, or not in the midbrain, brainstem, that you might have this opposite face and opposite body. This is the one exception. If you're up in the midbrain and you have this little tegmental lesion here, you could have the whole side of your face and body, all modalities affected with this particular lesion. Similar to if you had something up in your internal capsule affecting the whole half of your body and all modalities of sensation, pain, temp, proprioception. And then you also might see some decreased coordination. It might impact, this is a little bit, they kind of cut it off here, but sometimes this extends into and affects the superior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, so those are cerebellar fibers that are trying to make their way back up to the cortex to tell the cortex to the next signal they send down to make corrections, right? So if you damage some of those superior cerebellar peduncle fibers and those cerebellar fibers coming from the cerebellum to go to the cerebrum, that you could have coordination deficits. And the coordination deficits would be ipsilateral. Coordination deficits are always ipsilateral to the lesion, whether it's the cerebellum, whether it's in the cerebellar peduncles. And so this would be damage on the left. You'd have left-sided ataxia and coordination deficits. So the ataxia would be ipsy. However, and the coordination. You also damage the red nucleus here. So here's the red nucleus. The red nucleus helps to influence flexor muscles of the upper body. When you damage just the red nucleus, you tend not to have just frank weakness or paralysis of the flexor muscles of the upper body. They don't work quite as well, and it makes your arm look a little more uncoordinated. But it's not ataxia. It's due to red nucleus, some weakness, but not as profound as you would have if you damage the cortical-spinal tract fibers going to that. However, the red nucleus, right, the rubrospinal tract crosses over actually quite a way right here in this ventral tegmental area and goes down. So there would be some coordination deficits contralaterally just in the upper extremity. So you could have ipsilateral coordination deficits through the whole body if you affected a significant portion of those superior cerebellar peduncle fibers, but then you could have some slight weakness, coordination-like deficits in the contralateral upper extremity from the rubrospinal tract being damaged. So it's a little bit of a unique presentation. Thank God we're done with that. Now we get to this cerebrum's a little more, I don't know, not easy, but it's just you can see things. We're looking at big picture things versus all this little nitty-gritty detail. So we are going to open the cerebrum. A lot of this stuff's review. A lot of this cerebrum is things you've seen, heard, so that's good. Big picture, what does the cerebrum do? Gives you perception of the world around you, making sense of the world around you. Takes all that sensory information from somatosensory vision, smell, and makes sense, gives meaning to it. Voluntary movement, primarily, when you think and act because of voluntary control. Language, verbal and nonverbal language. I would love to just do a whole class on language or learn myself more about language. Just fascinating language. And also like visual perception. There's all kinds, you look at those brain game kind of things. A lot of those are based on some visual kind of perceptive tricks and those kind of things. Spatial relationships, where your body is in the world and where things are relative to each other and where your body parts are relative to each other. Your cerebrum helps you make sense of that. Utilizing visual information to act on the world, making decisions, consciousness, okay? Emotions, mind-body interactions, memory. Those are all the major features of the cerebrum. What makes up the cerebrum? Your cerebral hemispheres, which include your diencephalon, and you may want to put in parentheses under cerebral hemispheres, the basal ganglia are inside of there, are part of your cerebral hemispheres, are all part of your cerebrum. So we're going to talk a little more about the diencephalon. We've already talked about it as a relay structure, and all these connections with the basal ganglia, with your motor system, with your sensory system mainly. Information coming up to your body to go to the cortex, have to talk to the thalamus. The diencephalon really mainly makes up is the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Some people will consider the epithalamus and subthalamus as part of the diencephalon, but di is two, But you have two thalami. You have one on each side. So I don't know what they're meaning by diencephalon, but effectively it's really the thalamus and hypothalamus. But anything with an alamus on it is really part of the functional makeup of what some people consider the full diencephalon. What does it do? The thalamus proper, so we're just talking about just the thalamus, the big egg-like structure on each side right now. So the function of the thalamus proper is to primarily regulate flow of information to the cortex. It has three main functional groups of nuclei associated with it. It has the relay nuclei. This is the ones we've been talking about mostly, is the relay nuclei. That's information from sensory systems, from the basal ganglia, and from the cerebellum. Any of that information that's coming from those structures that's going to go up to the cortex has to stop by the thalamus. These tend to be located all in the ventral tier of the lateral nuclear group, and we'll show you a picture of what we mean by the ventral tier of the lateral nuclear group. So that's why we see those VPM, VPL, VA, VL. Those are all ventral, 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 ventral. It's that ventral tier in the lateral nuclear group that these tend to be located in. Then we have association nuclei, which are more for sensory integration. So there is actually, so a lot of sensory information is going into the thalamus, and it does a little bit of processing. It does quite a bit of integration right at the thalamus. And it does some of that as it delivers it back up to the cortex. So there's some processing going on. It's not a pure relay structure. There's some integration going on there. And it'll bring in information coming from a limbic system, emotions, memory. Most of those tend to be located in the anterior nuclei and the medial thalamus or the dorsal tier of the thalamus. So they tend to be spread out a little bit. They can be in the anterior nuclei, the medial thalamus, and the dorsal tier. Then we have nonspecific nuclei that tend to regulate consciousness, arousal, and attention. They're located in the reticular, midline, and interlaminar nuclei. And these tend to have some connections with your reticular activating system and your brainstem. You know, there's some connections between that and your brainstem. So this is kind of a good picture here. So this shows you, here's the thalamus proper, okay? And this is a left thalamus, is what we're looking at here. So we're looking at the lateral surface is closest to us, and then the medial surface. So that's a left thalamus. This is anterior up here. This is posterior back here. This is medial, and this is lateral out here. And this is nice because this color-coded, this shows you the connections that it has by color with those different regions of the brain. So that's the region of the cerebrum it's communicating with or has relays to, is that area, okay? And so this is a little bit more of how so you've got this egg-like structure, and this is, you know, anterior, posterior, lateral, and medial. And then this whole area is the lateral group. This is the ventral tier, so it's more ventral of the lateral group, is that area right there. It's called the ventral tier of the lateral group. And this area back here is the dorsal tier of the lateral group. It's more dorsal. Dorsal kind of this way, back and, you know, top and back. Then we have the medial group here, and then an anterior group here, and this is called the lamina that separates these things. And there's inside of the lamina is the interlaminar nuclei. There's actually some nuclei inside the lamina that divides lamina's layers. It divides this thalamus into some layers here. The ones we've really talked about so far are all of these right in here that I'm circling here, is the ones that you have been aware of and the ones you continue to need to know about. So here, you know, this is all in the ventral tier here, ventral lateral tier here. This is the ventral medial, so VPM, ventral posterior medial nucleus. It's in the ventral tier, but it's more posterior in the tier and more medial in the tier. Does that make sense, in that lateral group? And that's for the relay for, this is somatostatic or somaesthetic somatosensation from the head, trigeminal nerve mainly, bringing that information up to the VPM. And then here's the VPL, ventroposterolateral nucleus, so it's ventral tier, more posterior in that tier, and more lateral. The VPL is getting it from the body, you know, those from all the sensory tracts medial lemniscus, spinal lemniscus all come up there to deliver body sensation before it relays up to the cortex. And you'll see here this light blue color is associated with this region right here, which is more of your body sensation, and this little darker blue VPM is going to this area, which is where your face is located in the homunculus. And then we have our VA and VL, okay? The VA, if you remember, plays a role in basal ganglia circuitry. That's where the basal ganglia communicates with the thalamus before that thalamus goes back up to the cortex, okay? And some of the VL too, VA and VL. And then here's the cerebellum coming up, so some of the cerebellar information coming to that same region, okay, to communicate with the thalamus. Then on the back of the thalamus, this back part, this big kind of bump on the back here is also referred to as the pulvinar. But off the back of the pulvinar, on inferior back of the pulvinar here, we have a couple bumps here. One is the lateral geniculate nucleus, which is bringing in visual information. And then the other is the medial geniculate nucleus, which is where the cochlea delivers auditory information. That's going to then be relayed to the cortex for conscious awareness of vision. So you can see this lateral geniculate body has this color code here. It's going to the occipital lobe for vision. And then this lighter purple here, this medial, is going right there to that superior temporal gyrus for auditory information. That's the relay. So these lateral geniculate nuclei are bumps on the thalamus, so they act like thalamic structures. They're relay structures, those specific to vision and hearing. And then you can see in here, here's some of the intralaminar nuclei that are spread out here. All these intralaminar nuclei are kind of spread out through there. So this is what you need to know. You need to know the VPL, VPM, the VA for the basal ganglia, and then the VL, which is relay for information from the cerebellum, and then those medial and lateral geniculate nuclei or geniculate bodies. Those are the ones you need to know their relay and who they communicate with or what their connections are. Hypothalamus, it's a kind of the master regulator of our autonomic nervous system. Has thirst and hunger mechanisms in there, homeostasis, body temp, metabolism, blood pressure, water, food intake, excretion, digestion, reproduction. Plays a role in some emotional expression, especially pleasure, rage, and fear. So it has connections to your limbic system, the hypothalamus does. Regulation of circadian rhythms, endocrine regulation of growth, metabolism, reproduction. So we're not going to go into the hypothalamus too much. I mean, it's a very complex structure, but just know that it's, made of multiple nuclei. You don't really have to know those nuclei. Just know that it is composed of multiple regions or nuclei, and that it does have a nucleus that projects, axons down into the pituitary gland, to the posterior pituitary gland, and that's the kind of called the neurohypophysis, but it secretes neurotransmitters directly into the bloodstream that act kind of like hormones, but they're neurotransmitters you secrete actually into the bloodstream. But then some of these also influence secretion of the anterior pituitary gland, which is going to secrete hormonal substances into the bloodstream. So you have this division. And this right here, this little stalk is called the infundibulum, the infundibular stalk or infundibulum. And that connects the hypothalamus and those axons with the pituitary gland. And this pituitary gland sits in this bone in your skull that's kind of wraps around it like this, called the sella turcica. And there's a little membrane that kind of wraps around the top of the pituitary. So today, when we pull off if you want to come in, and I'm going to do the brain. I'm going to take a brain out right after after class. We'll just go over there if whoever wants to watch, and I'll probably do another one next week. I'm going to take the one out with the stroke today, and then there's a glioblastoma I'm going to take out next week. So when we pull the brain back, we're going to break that infundibulum. We might see the infundibulum. I'll try to point it out, or where the little membrane where the pituitary gland is sitting there. It's kind of fun to see. So. It's just showing you that the hypothalamus has connections with your limbic system. Your limbic system, and it's got bilateral connections, back and forth connections. So the limbic system can influence the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus can influence the limbic system. Remember, that's pleasure, rage, and fear. But also our autonomic system can go a little haywire when we're nervous, when we're frightened, when we're whatever, when we're upset. We get autonomic responses associated with that. Then the hypothalamus has connections with the pituitary gland, which we just showed you, to influence secretions. Spinal cord, and that's via the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus, so DLF. But remember, there's also sensory information coming back to the hypothalamus. The DLF also has an afferent component to it that's bringing in information, but also the brainstem influences the hypothalamus both ways. The solitary nucleus is bringing in information about your viscera, mainly through the vagus nerve, that tells it what's going on, about do I need to make adjustments to my heart rate, respiratory rate, those kind of things to accommodate things, metabolism, blah, 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 through the cranial nerves, especially parasympathetic cranial nerves. So that's going down the spinal cord is to influence sympathetic nervous system primarily, although there's the sacral component of the parasympathetic system that's down there. That's the DLF uses that to get to influence those. And the brainstem is primarily the majority of the parasympathetic control via the vagus nerve. Epithalamus, also known as the pineal gland. Okay, the primary role they think is one of its primary roles is regulation of circadian rhythms. And there's some evidence as you get older, as people get older, they actually sleep less sometimes as they get older. Your grandparents are up at 4 in the morning and that kind of stuff, and can influence their circadian rhythms because your pineal gland or your epithalamus can start to calcify. It secretes some melatonin, and then so you can changes in your levels of melatonin production and those kind of things, which influence circadian rhythms. It also influences secretions of the pituitary gland, the parathyroids, and the islet of Langerhans in the pancreas. So just very general, understand what it does in general terms, not specifically. So here it is, sitting right back here. And some of you saw that on our cross sections, those cross sections of the brain which you looked at, this little pineal gland poking off the back here. And sometimes when you poke on it, it can be hard and calcified on some of the specimens. So they've got more of that calcification going on. Subthalamic nucleus, you already know this, the subthalamus, subthalamic nucleus. It's part of the basal ganglia circuitry. It increases the inhibitor effect of output of the basal ganglia output nuclei. Sorry. It's part of the indirect loop. And the subthalamic role in that is to help the indirect loop inhibit motor output. That's why we have damage to the subthalamic nucleus. You get too much movement, okay? And sometimes they'll do the deep brain stimulation. They'll put the stimulation into the subthalamic nucleus, but the stimulation, what it does is it cancels it out, basically scrambles the signal from the subthalamic nucleus, so the subthalamic nucleus has less influence, and that allows you to have more motor output. For somebody with Parkinson's disease, you're trying to cancel out the subthalamic nucleus's influence in the indirect loop that leads to less movement. You're trying to cancel it out so you have the direct loop even being more powerful and allowing more movement. All right, so that's the thalamus and all the alamuses. Now we're going to talk, so that was what's in the cerebrum we're talking. Now we're going to get to subcortical structures. So down, mainly we're going to talk about some white matter structures here, what's happening in the white matter. So the subcortical white matter, we're talking about them as projection fibers, and then we'll go through the different types of fibers here. So the first one are projection fibers that are going typically from the spinal cord to the basal ganglia, thalamus, brainstem. They're projecting from one structure to another typically within one side of your brain. Okay, so they're not crossing over from one side. This is going usually vertically. These are kind of more, tend to be more vertically oriented structures, or white matter structures. They're projecting, you know, up and down. Okay. So mainly we're talking here is the internal capsule and the corona radiata. So this is a really nice, they've peeled away some of the cortex and they've really kind of teased out these corona radiata fibers coming down from the cortex. And then they get pinched down in here between the basal ganglia and the thalamus as internal capsule fibers here. And then they start to project down as, you know, this is your, you know, cortical spinal, cortical pontine, cortical bulbar tracts down the front here. And then we've also got projection fibers coming back here up the back that tend to be your spinal lemniscus, medial lemniscus, that tend to run a little more towards the back of the brainstem. And then here's projection fibers from the cerebellum that are coming from the cortical pontine fibers and the pontine nuclei, and then also they project, some of those project up into the cortex via the superior cerebellar peduncle. So we also have projection fibers coming from your spinal cord that are going into your cerebellum. So that's what we're talking about, these projection fibers running up and down, typically more so. This is a little bit where it's running crossways, but. So in a coronal section here, just appreciating the internal capsule here. Corona radiata would be fibers in here. Projection fibers. And then here's our internal capsule, posterior limb and anterior limb of internal capsule. Posterior limb is where our motor and sensory tracts are running. Actually, I'm back here, more in the back part of the posterior limb. Actually, I take that back. No, it's not in the back part. It's more towards this region right in here, and towards that genu. But some of our cerebellar and basal ganglia fibers run a little more in the anterior limb. I may have a picture here. Yeah, so here's our globus pallidus and putamen out here. This is the thalamus, this is the caudate, so this is anterior, this is posterior. So here is that, those are your motor tracts right here near that genu and that bend there, and then this is your sensory back here. And then within this anterior limb is some of your tracts that are conveying information from your cerebellum and your basal ganglia. So that's projection fibers. Now we're talking about another type of fiber called commissural fibers. These are all just white matter fibers. Commissural fibers commiserate, commissural, bring together, they join one homologous area of the cerebral hemispheres with the other one on the other side. So they're joining up left and right. The same things on each side of the cerebral hemispheres. Okay, you have the corpus callosum is the big one that does the majority of that. That big corpus callosum allows coordination and communication between the hemispheres, frontal lobes, parietal lobes. Okay, some occipital lobe, and then you have the anterior and posterior commissures that also assist with this. Okay, that also have they're much smaller. And then we have association fibers. Association fibers associate one area of the cerebrum with another on the same side. And they tend to run more anterior to posterior because our cerebrum's kind of laid out that way, so they tend to run more anterior to posterior. It connects cortical regions within one hemisphere because they allow association of information within that hemisphere. So in green is your commissural fibers, okay? So here's our big corpus callosum right here. Here's our anterior commissure. This is looking at the sagittal section. Then in the frontal, the coronal section or frontal section, here's our corpus callosum up here. This is our anterior commissure here that connects the two temporal lobes. They don't show the posterior commissure here. That's okay, not quite that important, but posterior commissure is even smaller than the anterior commissure. That's connecting one side of the hemispheres to the other. And then we have our association fibers, which are in blue. So you'll see most of these association fibers are running kind of this way. And so this one right here is called the superior longitudinal fasciculus. It's superior, it's longitudinal, it's this long longitudinal structure here, fasciculus. Remember, a fasciculus is a bundle of axons, so that's just a white matter bundle there running from your frontal lobe all the way from your frontal lobe into your parietal lobe to allow association between sensory information, prefrontal decision making based on that sensory information. What happened there? Come back. That's all right. And then that's a superior longitudinal fasciculus. Then we have a long one down here at the bottom that goes all the way from your occipital lobes into your temporal lobes. Okay, so visual information going into your temporal lobes for memory and for making sense of visual information. That's the inferior longitudinal fasciculus. Then we have some short association fibers. So there's little short association fibers that often aren't named, but they'll just associate like this. This is actually your precentral gyrus here, and this is your postcentral gyrus. So these little short association fibers allow some immediate connection between sensory and motor information right between those two gyruses that are close to each other. Some might jump a few gyruses. There's fibers here that kind of run around this way, and I don't know if they're pointing. They have a little. They're pointing just to these couple fibers here, but there's a fibrous ring here that is important for connecting, and I think it's this one here, but this may not be it. But it's right in this area called the arcuate fasciculus. And the arcuate fasciculus, what it does is it joins up on at least on our left side of our brain for most of us, in our speech centers, is our motor planning areas for speech with our understanding areas of speech, and links those up. And you'll see when we get to language here, we'll go through and you'll see this arcuate fasciculus, which is just these association fibers that allow communication between the different speech centers in your brain on one side of your hemisphere. On the left side of your hemisphere, it's more for auditory and reading and understanding written and spoken language. On the right side of your brain, it's for understanding nonverbal expression. Okay, so body language and so forth. You have expression of body language and also reading people's body language, and that happens on the right side of your brain for most people. Some people, there's a few small percentage population, those are switched, where your right side of your brain is your one for auditory and spoken and written language, and your left side is for spatial. So. Cerebral cortex, we're right on the very surface now, the cerebral cortex itself, that little bit, a few millimeters thickness cerebral cortex. Mostly cell bodies in that cerebral cortex is what we're talking about, is just mostly the cell bodies. It has multiple layers. So this is what the cerebral cortex looks like. It's got 6 layers, okay? So you can see these are the 6 layers, and we'll go through the ones you need to know. And then here's the white matter. So you can see these are where all the axons start to begin here from all these. These are all the cell bodies up in here, you can see. But then down here, these are start to become where the axons start, okay, that are projecting from all those cell bodies. I mean, there's axons coming from all these cell bodies up here. But once you get down here, it's mainly just white matter at that point. And there's a few you can still see a few cell bodies in there, but mainly it's white matter. So layers of the cerebral cortex. Layer 1 is called the molecular layer. The most superficial layer contains actually few nerve cells, but many dendrites and axonal processes for synaptic interaction. So you see how this is much lighter in color? Well, here's all these cell bodies. They're projecting up a lot of dendrites and axons into this region, and there's a lot of talk going on up there, a lot of overlap of those dendrites up in there that are allowing for communication and integration of information. Okay. Then we have the layer 2, which is called the external granular layer. It contains many small neurons, which are more for establishing the intracortical connections, like those little short association fibers and so forth. That's where those are originating from, is the extragranular layer. Layer 2 gives rise to medium-sized neurons, giving rise to the longer association fibers and commissural fibers, okay, like your corpus callosum and your superior longitudinal fasciculus and those kind of things. Those are the types of cell bodies that are there that are giving rise to those longer axons that are going to reach and get connections through larger areas of your cerebrum. Layer 4 is the internal granular layer. It's the site of termination of afferent fibers from specific thalamic nuclei. So that's where that information, all that information from your body, face, basal ganglia, and thalamus, and cerebellum, are going to end up terminating in that layer 4, the internal granular layer, was where their final stopping point is, to cell bodies in there. Talk to those cells. Layer 5 is called the internal pyramidal layer. It's the origin of projection fibers to extracortical targets. So when you're going to go to, you're not a commissural fiber, you're not a short association fiber, you're going to project to, this is for where the projection fibers come from. You're going to go to the basal ganglia, you're going to go to the thalamus, you're going to go to the brainstem, you're going to go all the way down to the spinal cord. These are where the projection fibers originate. In the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe, this is where what's called the giant Bet cells start. These are the ones that are going to project all the way down into your spinal cord, that are big, long, that have to make big, long axons, so they're big cell bodies that are kind of project down there, okay, and become your pyramidal tract. And if you look here, you can see when you get down in those layers, like layer 5 here, you can see, oh, look at how big some of these cell bodies are, okay? And then so like this could be one of those giant Bet cells, right? Let me erase. Like right here could be an example of that. And you see how it's kind of pyramidal? It's got a pyramid shape to it. That's why, you know, this could be a projection. This could be a cortical spinal tract fiber. And that's why they call it a pyramidal tract fiber, because of that shape of its origin of its cell that starts those giant Bet cells. And then layer 6 is called multiform. It also contains association and projection neurons. It's just harder to, it's a mix. It's kind of multiform. It does a variety of cells mixed down there in that layer number 6. We've mentioned Brodmann's numbers or Brodmann's areas, so there's a nomenclature where you can number these areas of the surface of your cerebrum that are typically associated with specific functions, okay? And there's 52 different named areas here. You don't need to know all 52. I've listed the ones you need to know. So for the sensory areas of your cerebrum, you need to know these: 3, 1, and 2. I don't know why they don't have it 1, 2, 3, but it goes from anterior to posterior. They're layered at 3, 1, and 2 as it goes back. You'll see here in a second. That's in order of how you would go back from in the sensory system. You have the secondary somatosensory is areas 5 and 7. Primary vision is area 17. Secondary is 18. 41 is primary auditory. 42 is secondary. 44 and 45 are Broca's area, and 22 is Wernicke's area. And then motor areas, a lot less you need to know there. 4 is going to be your primary motor cortex. 6 and 8 together are your premotor and supplementary motor areas. And 9 through 12 are all prefrontal areas, prefrontal cortex. So you can see here's your primary sensory areas right here, and it's got this little area at the right along the central sulcus that's called area number 3, and then 1, and then 2. And I don't know the distinction between what happens in those areas. It's just, I think it's more there's a cellular difference that when you look at the side of, you know, in addition to looking at the layers of your cells, if you look at them just across different regions of your cerebrum, they change a little bit. And so that's what I think this is more of a cytoarchitectural look at, and then it happens to match up with functions of cells. If they look a little different, they happen to tend to have different functions. But anyway, I would just know this as a group. The primary sensory area, this whole area is made up of Brodmann's areas 3, 1, and 2. Here's the primary vision back here is 17 on the medial. 17 is mainly on the medial surface of the cerebrum. Most of our primary vision is on the medial surface. Then 17 out here is the secondary visual areas. Here's primary auditory 41, then it's secondary auditory, which is right around it, is area 42. 44 and 45, this is Broca's area. This is your motor planning area for speech, for production of speech and also written language. And then, 9, 10, 11, I don't see 12 on here. That might be tucked underneath there a little farther. This is all prefrontal cortex. And then here's your 6, which is your 6 is premotor, and 4 here is primary. Let's see here. What does it say? 4 is primary motor, correct. There's 4 is primary motor. This is actually, so your premotor is right down here. Then all this up here, this is supplementary motor. And so supplementary motor carries over between areas 6 and 8. But all you need to know is if 6 and 8 together are your premotor, supplementary, or motor planning, okay, areas are 6 and 8 together. And then primary motor is area 4. So this just shows you, now this is a little simpler to see, just showing, like, here's the primary sensory areas. So we have primary, for sensory areas, we typically have a primary and a secondary area. The primary area is where the information arrives initially. Secondary areas is where it's more processed and made that sensory information, something's made sense of it and gives it meaning, okay? Or organizes that sensation so that it can be sent up to your frontal lobes to be interpreted. Okay, and so here's the 3, 1, and 2 areas. That's primary. We also have a specific region where we get conscious awareness right here, as just behind, kind of in between our primary or the kind of in that transition zone between the parietal and frontal lobes here. Well, this is all parietal lobe. I take that back, but just in this region, vestibular, conscious awareness of where our head is in space. There's a lot of unconscious information about our vestibular system that goes directly to our cerebellum and the vestibular nuclei, and then to adjust. But where your head is in space. If somebody tilts your head, which way it's tilting, and so forth. And some of that's told by your vestibular system, which goes to that specific region, is area 40. It's called. Here's your primary visual cortices on the lateral surface. Here's your primary auditory on the lateral surface in the temporal lobe. But then you see primary vision extends all to this medial surface. Is right on the lips of that. Remember, that's the calcarine sulcus right there, is where you have all your primary vision going to. And then somatosensation wraps all the way over to the medial surface a little bit. That's where your leg is. Your leg and foot are wrapped over that. So when you're looking at these functions, primary cortical areas for sensory. So primary somatosensation discriminates the shape, texture, or size of objects. Primary auditory is conscious discrimination of the loudness and the pitch of a sound. And the primary visual distinguishes the intensity of the light, the shape of an object's size, and general location. It doesn't tell you what it is, it just tells you these are the things, and then we'll talk about secondary areas. Primary vestibular discriminates among head positions and head movements. We just talked about that. That's that for conscious awareness of that. Then here's the secondary sensory areas. So the secondary regions, look how much bigger they are, because there's a lot more. This is where you make sense of the information and you process it. So they are in larger areas. It doesn't take a lot just to accept the information and have it delivered to that small region, and then the secondary sensory areas, via some of those little short association fibers, deliver that information to the association areas to make sense of it. Okay, so that's this area 5 and 7, which is a big part of your parietal lobe back here. And then you see how much of your visual cortex back here is the secondary areas, of your occipital lobe is the secondary visual areas. And then here's your big secondary area of your auditory area. And then there's some more vision that goes here, even down for memory, down to the temporal lobes via that inferior longitudinal fasciculus that delivers that information there. So what does it do? Somatosensory association areas are where you actually perceive things like stereoagnosis, and you have memory of the tactile and spatial environment, where you actually formulate what is this object I'm holding and make sense of that object. Visual association areas are for analysis of motion, color, and control of your visual fixation. Remember, once you lock onto an object, that occipital lobe helps track it, but then also you analyze the motion and the color of it. Okay? And then the auditory association areas for reclassifying sounds. So the auditory association area would say, hey, that's somebody talking to me. I better use the arcuate fasciculus to send it up to Wernicke's area to interpret what that talking is. Or, hey, no, that's a train that's about to hit me, blaring its horn. Send that to my motor system and limbic structures to get the heck out of, step on the gas or get out of the way, that kind of stuff. So that's what the auditory association area does. We have the same kind of thing for primary, and we call primary motor cortices, and then we have motor planning. We don't call them association areas, they're motor planning areas. So there's the primary motor and there's the motor planning areas. We already gone through what those are. Primary motor, area 4, this one, and then we have our supplementary area and premotors, which are 6 and 8. They show just 6 here, but extends out a little bit here, 6 and 8. And then Broca's area, 44 and 45 down here. And they also, some of those wrap over to that medial surface there. So primary motor area, it does voluntary controlled movements. When you choose to do something in a given time, especially things that are, require some dexterity, they're novel in nature, and require that voluntary control, okay? The premotor area is for control mainly of trunk and girdle muscles and making anticipatory postural adjustments so that, hey, I've done this task before. I'm anticipating it's going to be similar to what I've done before. My premotor area is going to set up that when I voluntarily move my arm, I'm going to be likely to be more successful because I know that I better turn on my paraspinals to counteract my arm reaching out here. Or I'm going to pull that door open. I know it's a heavy door because I've opened that door before. My premotor area is going to set it up by turning on my gastrocs, my posterior chain muscles. So when I pull that door towards me, I'm not going to get pulled forward. Does that make sense? But my primary motor area is sending the signals to my biceps and my hands to go ahead and do the pull of the door. Okay. The supplementary motor area is important for initiation of movement, orientation and planning, bimanual and sequential movements, especially movements that you've done a lot of before that are more repetitive, like sit to stand. The premotor area, the supplementary motor area is important for helping, and it has to go through the basal ganglia circuitry, right? All this stuff goes to the basal ganglia as well. But initiating that movement of something like standing up, and then sequential tasks now, walk forward, things like that, or buttoning shirts, or putting on your pants, or dressing, or doing things like cleaning and cooking and those kind of things, those that you do repetitively all the time. Very simple. You don't have to think about those anymore. They come a little more automatically, novel in nature, that require this sequential and bimanual tasks. That you're a little more active. All these areas are active during all tasks, just about how much more activity proportionally one is during different tasks. Okay. Broca's area, that is the motor planning for speech, usually in the left hemisphere only. For most people, that left hemisphere area, area 44 and 45 is for production of speech, planning, what am I going to say, how I'm going to sequence the movements of my mouth and the words to make sense, okay? That happens in Broca's area. On the right side, it's the sequencing and the planning for nonverbal communication, okay? What arm movements and body movements and facial movements am I going to make to convey that message, okay? That's the next one there. That's analogous to Broca's area. Usually, it does do some tone of voice and emotional gestures, usually in the right hemisphere. Then we have what's called some general association areas. These are the ones that tend to be in the prefrontal cortex, and then this parietal temporal association. There's this kind of area that lives between these other secondary association areas that helps basically associate now all this information from the different regions this touches all the different lobes. You know, it has communication with the frontal lobes, the parietal lobes, the occipital lobes, the temporal lobes. There's a zone here that all of those guys kind of meet, all that information coming in from those secondary, so it goes to the primary association cortices, then it goes to the secondary association cortices, and then it converges in the parietal temporal association areas and the prefrontal association areas. That's where you finally make sense of it all and really able to make decisions and move and make decisions based on information with the prefrontal lobe. And the parietal temporal association brings all those modalities of sensation together to give us a better sense of where our body is in the world and space and all those kind of things. So the prefrontal is the executive function. That's, you see what it does. The parietal temporal association helps with problem solving, comprehensive communication, spatial relationships. Limbic association area, those are down here, more in this inferior frontal lobe area, down kind of in this region here. They tend to do a little bit more with mood, affect, and some memory. Let's just go through this, then we'll take a break. So this is showing you, here's primary sensory. Information, first of all, comes in to a primary sensory area, whether that's somatosensation, vision, auditory. Generally, it tells you about the intensity or quality of that sensory information coming in. Then it goes to a secondary, or yes, sensory association cortices, or secondary association cortices of some type, that recognizes sensation, classifies the sensation, and then that information is delivered to one of the larger association cortices that helps you with goal planning, interpretation of that sensation, emotional overlay or effects of that sensation on you. And then if you have to respond to it, you send it to the motor planning areas that kind of decide, is this something I've done before? Can I use a pre-programmed little thing to do this? Or is it a novel thing? And then I got to send that to the primary cortex to actually act on that, make action based on the sensory input that came in. Okay? Break time. And we are now talking about the limbic system. The limbic system has a number of components that all work together. Hypothalamus, because it helps to modulate autonomic, responses to limbic system kind of changes. The anterior and medial nuclei of the thalamus have an integrative role for the limbic system. The limbic cortex, those are cortical regions in your cerebrum that are primarily where these some limbic system function happens. The cingulate gyrus, remember the cingulate gyrus right around that C-shaped one right near the corpus callosum is a cingulate gyrus. The parahippocampal gyrus, and then the uncus. Those are limbic cortex. The hippocampus itself is a limbic system structure. It plays a role in memory, but also emotional memory and responses. And then the amygdala, which is sitting right at the tip of your caudate nucleus tails. The tails that wrap around. The caudate nucleus is kind of sitting there in the temporal lobes near the hippocampus as well, mainly for fear. And then the basal forebrain, that front inferior part of the forebrain, is a limbic system processing structure. This is just showing you some of these limbic system structures. This is the cingulate gyrus here. They've pulled away some of the brain here and the ventricles, but this is the cingulate gyrus. Wrapping right around the corpus callosum. And here's the amygdala here. Hippocampus is down in here, this region. This is your temporal lobes down here. Hypothalamus they don't show here, I don't think. I don't see a hypothalamus here. Some people consider the olfactory system, the olfactory bulb and tract, as part of the limbic system because it goes directly into your medial temporal lobe here near that uncus and parahippocampal gyrus region. The limbic system, M-O-V-E's us, moves us. So if you kind of remember that, memory and motivation. Olfaction, so here we are including olfactory system. Visceral control, autonomic responses to limbic system function or input, and emotion. Okay, self-concept and worth, body image, attitudes, social skills, opinions. All these things are important activities or functions of the limbic system. You have to understand that our mind and body are intertwined, and you can't separate mind from body. And part of that reason is because of the limbic system. The limbic system is how we connect our mind and our body together. It's very involved in the stress response, chronic stress responses. It can be magnified in individuals with CNS. If you have central nervous system damage to certain regions of your cerebral cortex, your frontal lobes, your limbic system function can go a little haywire, or you also may have difficulty modulating your own limbic system, because normally you might have some rational ability to say, hey, this situation that I'm experiencing is stressful, but it's temporary, no need to get too upset about it. Or you can use things like distraction to, or go out and do meditation. But if you've got a head injury impacting your frontal lobe and you can't make those decisions about what's really, stressful, truly stressful, and adaptive processes to modulate it, you can start this process where you go in and maybe you're as a therapist working with a brain injury patient, and if you cause some physical stress or pain to them, like get them on a treadmill and get their heart rate up, they perceive it as this very stressful, life-altering, threatening event, and they just go crazy on you, and their heart rate and blood pressure shoots through the roof. They go into a rage. They start trying to throw punches at you. So those are things you have to understand when you have, especially frontal lobe damage in a head injury patient, that can lead to inhibition of the limbic system. Or you have patients who have, for example, strokes that involve maybe some of the connections of the limbic system, who have profound, they call it pseudobulbar effect or bulbar effect, where they have crying fits, and they just start crying on you, and they may even say, I'm not particularly sad, and you're just like, but it's dysfunction of limbic system function that causes them to start crying, or start to laugh uncontrollably, inappropriately, that can also be something related to this control. You guys have already learned about, no, you haven't had the wellness class yet, about prolonged cortisol responses, and because of our autonomic system control over release of cortisol. And if you have that too high of circulating levels of cortisol for too long, then you also depress your immune system, then you're more prone to get sick, and it just can lead to lots of things. So, okay. A lot of that, again, is mediated through the hypothalamus. Here's the limbic system here, physical sensations, psychological perceptions. Your limbic system interprets those and say, hey, is this something I need to be concerned about or worried about? And if I am, do I need to institute some kind of response physiologically in response to that? And most of that's mediated through the hypothalamus and autonomic function. Talk about memory now briefly. That's a very cerebral function. Memory is a cerebral function, at least the type of memory we're talking about, like you're doing now. Declarative type memory and emotional type memories are the two that are mainly cerebral type processes. Procedural memories, skill-based memories, can also happen in the cerebrum, but a lot of that's also done on the cerebellum as well, which it doesn't show there, but cerebellum is very important for cerebral, for procedural memory. So the types of memory, so we have emotional memory. These are feelings, remembering previous emotions and feelings. Declarative memory, you're declaring something, you're declaring this fact, something you know, and you can write on paper, or you can tell me back a fact, a figure, that kind of thing. That's events, concepts, locations, those kind of things. That's mainly cerebral cortex and hippocampus, okay? And then procedural memory, that's skilled movements. This is motor learning, procedure. You're learning a procedure. You're doing a procedure or a skill. That's some frontal cortex, thalamus, basal ganglia, and I would add cerebellum on there. So people that have, like, especially some frontal cortex or hippocampal involvement, like Alzheimer's disease, cannot remember who you are as a therapist every day you walk in, yet you could still teach them to get better at walking or to improve in a sit-to-stand transfer. If you do enough repetitions of that, they typically still have a pretty well-functioning cerebellum, basal ganglia, motor system, that you can do enough repetition where they still don't know that you did practice sit-to-stands with them for the last 2 weeks, but they'll get better at sit-to-stands. It used to be that we would actually get denied payment for people with dementia because they would say, well, they can't learn anything new, including motor acts. But we know now that they can learn motor acts. They may not be able to remember what those motor acts are or remember you, but they can learn new physical skills. And that's not a reason not to treat somebody with dementia just because that, but you have to come up with repetitive tasks that they can do without a lot of cognitive processing. Communication is a cerebral activity, okay? So what is this? What we say to dogs? Of course, we're telling the dog what to do, and this is what the dog hears, right? And I know cats definitely don't understand anything we say because my cat won't listen to me. But I'm assuming this is basically, though, what you guys hear from us as teachers. It's like we think we're just telling us incredible information. All you hear after the first 10 minutes is blah, blah, blah. That's when you go back to listen to these lectures later. Get them in small enough bite-sized chunks you can handle. So cerebral communication for verbal and written communication, I should specify here. 95% of us use the left hemisphere for reading, writing, understanding verbal and speaking, okay, as on the left side. We have a couple regions that are important for that on this left side. We have the Wernicke's area, which is for comprehension of language. So understanding when somebody's talking to us or reading a piece of paper and understanding written language. That's happening all in this Wernicke's area. And the Broca's area is for production of language and instructions for language output. That includes verbal and written expression, okay, in Broca's area. We have a corresponding areas in the right hemisphere for nonverbal communication, and those same areas for producing and understanding nonverbal communication. So let's kind of track through the process of communication. So this is the left hemisphere. So this is going to be verbal communication we're talking about here. Somebody says something to you. It goes to the primary auditory cortex. Right there on that superior temporal gyrus. That then goes to the secondary auditory cortex that classifies that sound you just heard and says, oh, that's somebody speaking to me. That's a spoken word. That's speech. Okay, I need to make sense of that speech. So that sends it via this is part of the longitude, this is part of the arcuate fasciculus. These are white matter fibers that allow you to send signals between these different regions. So, you use the arcuate fasciculus then to communicate with Wernicke's area, right back here, that makes sense of what that language is and gives meaning to the language. Oh, you say, oh, they're telling me to, go do this, whatever. And then that information is sent to Broca's area, which is the motor planning area for speech, and it says, I need to respond to this, and I plan on saying these words in this order and putting these syllables together in this order to make sense, to send that signal and to communicate back to that person. Then that information is sent to your primary motor area for your muscles of your face and tongue and larynx and pharynx to actually produce that speech. And that's kind of the process that occurs there. And if you have damaged anywhere along the way to that process, you're going to have some kind of communication deficit. Okay? Spatial awareness is on the right side of your brain typically, generally a right hemisphere, and corresponding to Wernicke's area. This is where you have an awareness of your body schema, your own body in space, and your body relationship to the surroundings and the spatial orientation to the external world, and then also for interpretation of people's bodies and their body language and their body positions and so forth. Okay? That's Wernicke, understanding this nonverbal communication, partially relation to the fact that you understand where your body is in space and where somebody else's body is in space, and so that the movements they're making have some meaning to them. That's the end of this section, which is great. We're going to get into more language here. We're going to actually we're going to switch gears here. We're going to go to the cerebrum clinical applications, which is the next lecture here. Let me get out of this one. And we'll get into some nice examples of language. Okay. So we're just going to go through some clinical applications when you have injuries or damage to certain regions of the brain in the cerebrum, and how that looks clinically and how that affects us as physical therapists. So there are rare, they're pretty rare, but thalamic injuries, I guess they're not that rare. There's common, relatively common, I guess, thalamic injuries because stroke. Stroke has there's deep penetrating branches off your middle cerebral artery that go to your thalamus, so you can get thalamic injuries. If you have damage to the thalamus that involves one of those relay nuclei, like the VPM or the VPL, that region right there can certainly cause contralateral sensory loss, because that's that area going to the thalamus, okay? The other thing about the thalamic injury is kind of interesting is if you have damage to the thalamus, is this thing called contraversive pushing or lateral pulsion or pushing syndrome. This is kind of a unique thing, and until you experience it, it's like you don't believe it, and then when you experience it, you're like, what, this is crazy, and you're like, can a patient really feel this way? This is where they don't perceive. Your thalamus is it involves in perceiving and bringing in some sensory information and processing about your position of your body in space that is relayed often to your right side of your cerebrum, but a thalamic lesion on either side of your cerebrum could cause this type of lateral pulsion. And what they do is they actually push towards the side of their injury. So if I have a left, I'm sorry, not towards the side, but towards their side of weakness. So I guess if they had, so if I have a left thalamic injury that could be causing right-sided deficits, I will tend to push towards the side of deficits away from the side of the lesion. It's controversial. Lateral pulsion, they push towards the weak side, okay? And which just makes totally counterintuitive. You wouldn't expect your patient to push towards their weak side because they basically make themselves fall over or push towards it. And it's really interesting. What you'll do is so this person you're having sitting on the bed, and they're sitting there and they're pushing themselves over, and you have to hold them up. And the more you try to hold them up and give them support on this shoulder, the harder they push into you. They don't even perceive, and then once they feel that contact pressure, they keep pushing harder into your hand. And so the harder you push, the harder they're pushing. You're getting this fight, but you can't let go, because if you let go, they'll just fall over. So, but what you really want to do in that case is usually if I'm sitting behind or in front of them, is I have to transfer where I'm holding here and push down on this shoulder and drag them this way by putting contact and proprioceptive information into this area. The other thing you do is what they'll oftentimes do, they'll be sitting on the edge of a mat or bed, and they'll be, so I've got a left-sided lesion and I'm pushing to the right, and they'll sit like this and think they're straight. They'll literally think they're straight like this, and they'll be sitting like this. And so you're trying to hold them up. Instead, I'm going to push down on this shoulder, push down on this hip, and try to get them to shift their weight this way. But also a lot of times their hand is pushing actively with their arm, so you have to take their arm, put it in their lap, or get it away from them. And also push with their legs, so you actually have to sometimes raise up the mat table so their leg won't push on the ground and make it harder. And then a lot of times what I'll do is I'll have them actually lean on this kind of elbow like this and work on shifting their alignment towards that side and do some weight bearing, and then bring them back up into that center position again, and hopefully not be pushing so hard to that side. It's usually temporary. I mean, usually people get over it for the most part, but it can slow down your rehab process for that first week or so. So I'm writing goals for these people. If they have this lateral pulsion or called contraversive pushing, then I'm going to be typically a week or two behind on my goals to get through that first phase. And it's just, and you can show them a mirror of themselves, and they'll know that they're way over there, but their body, assumes that midline is way over there, even though visually they see they're leaning, that they can't do anything about it. Occasionally, if if the thalamus gets damaged in a small lesion in a specific region of the thalamus, I don't know exactly what region, but the region that would probably process pain, you make it malfunction and it actually causes increased pain. And it's called thalamic pain syndrome, where the whole, like half of their body could be painful. You know, as opposed to having lack of pain sensation, they might have a little haywire in the processing of pain, and they actually experience more pain in the whole side of their body. So this is actually a really good lesion here. There's a thalamus here on each side, and this is kind of in that lateral tier, right? You know, this is that lateral tier, and that probably a lesion extends down into that dorsal, and it's the dorsal area too. This is kind of that dorsal lateral tier that we're talking about here. Well, we're looking from a top, but it extends down, I'm sure. So we're probably impacting some of that VPM, VPL regions that would lead to some contralateral loss of sensation. If we have damage in the cerebrum, if it goes to the subcortical white matter, that's what we're going to talk about now, is when you're damaging that subcortical white matter versus the cortex, and this is the axons. So internal capsule damage, we've mentioned this a few times. So here's that internal capsule all compressed down in here, sensory and motor. So small infarcts, small lesions, that's a little tiny little, you know, almost like a head of a eraser lesion, can cause a pretty big deficit in sensory and motor contralaterally. Okay, these are often referred to as lacunar infarcts. If it's not a bleed, if somebody has like a little bit of a blockage to a small vessel, that deep penetrating branches of the middle cerebral artery that go up into the subcortical white matter, the very end of that distribution of that artery is just a little small area that's being supplied. And those can get impacted, especially in people that have long-term hypertension. They lay down these waxy deposits, and those waxy deposits will tend to clog the smallest vessels first. So they'll start to get these little pockmark. When you slice through some of these brains, somebody who's been diabetic for a long time, had vascular disease, you'll see these little just divots in their brain all over the place, these little tiny lacunar infarcts. And you can get away with lacunar infarcts where you may not get a lot of dysfunction, but if it happens to hit right in the internal capsule and hit some primary motor and sensory pathways, you'll notice it. But if it's little pockmarks in your frontal lobes and so forth, you won't notice it till they accumulate over time, and then you start to notice they're not thinking quite right, or they don't make the best decisions, or they're starting to look a little clumsy now. It takes an accumulation of these lacunar infarcts in a lot of ways to start to see the deficits over time. But if you get them in the right area, it can really cause deficits that are out of proportion to the size of the lesion. For the white matter tracts, there's a procedure I've heard of called a colosotomy, where they cut the corpus callosum entirely. They just take a scalpel and cut right down through your corpus callosum. It's typically done in kids who have intractable seizures, because the way that if you have a seizure that starts in one hemisphere and it starts to spread, one of the ways it spreads is through the corpus callosum to get to that, so that everything seizes. So one way to decrease the activity of the seizure is to cut the corpus callosum so it can't spread. It's very interesting is that initially there's some conflicts with hand function, like because you use your corpus callosum to help coordinate between your hands for bimanual tasks and so forth. But if it's done as a young child, very quickly your brain adapts to that and is able to overcome most of that. It'd be really hard to pick up, you know, in somebody. And basically they have a normal performance on a neuro exam after they have compensation after the corpus callosum. So that's amazing. You can cut a structure that big, and a person could be walking around, you would have no idea that you've cut their entire corpus callosum. And there's a few, like you have to set up a very contrived scenario to find out people that have this problem or have had this done. And I think I've got a picture here. So basically you have to have this special box, and there's a box here and it's got a little slit here that you could just reach your hand into, okay? And this is blocking this person's vision. They can't see over that to see what's down inside this box, right? And so in this case, if this person has a colosotomy and we've blocked it here, so what happens is if you were to have this patient, if you flash the words ball up here onto this that's usually white colored there, and they'll flash the word really quickly so it only goes to your left visual field, right? And if they flash it so quickly that you can't have time to deviate your eyes to look at it, and so but it goes to your left visual field, okay? Which that left visual field goes to your right cortex, right? It's going to go through your brainstem and the lateral geniculate nucleus, and it's going to end up, that information is going to go to the right side of your brain. Information, if you remember from Megan, I don't know if you remember from Megan's lecture, but the left visual field information goes to your right side of your brain, your right visual field information goes to your left side. So it goes over here. And so if we did it to the left side of his visual field, goes to the right side of the brain, the word ball is recognized in that secondary and primary visual cortices. Normally what you'd have to do in order for you, so they're asking them, say the word that was just presented to your left, that was presented. They actually are seeing the word ball. It is registering in their brain, but they can't say what it is because they can't send that signal over to Wernicke's area, which is then going to interpret that word as ball, and then it's going to send it up the Broca's area to say ball, but you can't even get the signal from that left visual field over to, so they see that word, and but they can't tell you what it is, that word. They're visually seeing it, but they can't tell you what it is because they can't transfer the image over to Wernicke's area to be interpreted. They can see the lines are doing, and they look like they represent symbols, but they can't tell you what that word is because they can't send the signal over there. But in the real world, you never would have, you would always could you could just deviate your eyes over, and so that image would fall on both hemispheres, and then you could interpret it and say it there. So does that make sense? If they left that image up long enough, your eyes would eventually drift over and take a look at that image, and it would go, so they have to do it really quickly, so it only goes to that right hemisphere. And then kind of the same thing with, they'll maybe put an object in here, and they'll say, hold on and manipulate the object with your left hand. So they're manipulating this object. Tell me what the object is. So it goes over here. All the information goes over to the right primary sensory area and secondary sensory areas. And you're feeling the texture, that it's round, that it's whatever. But you can't send that information over to Wernicke's area and to the Broca's area to say ball. You know it's a round structure, but you can't say it's a ball. You know, even though you've felt a ball a million times in your life, if you set it up that way, you would not be able to say it's a ball. But in the real world, you're going to feel it with both hands, or you're going to put it in both hands, and so this is where you would never notice this in somebody's, or you'd have vision at the same time. You have vision and somatosensation from both visual fields, so you have to set up this very contrived situation to actually, and they may even say they don't see anything, or they feel something, but they don't know what it is. So anyway. So now let's talk about disorders of specific areas of the cerebral cortex. Okay, so if you have primary sensory areas damaged, so that primary sensory strip there, you'll have inability to discriminate the intensity and the quality of a sensory stimulus. Primarily, you'll have difficulty with localization of touch and proprioception, more so than pain and temperature. Crude touch tends not to be so affected. Crude touch is processed somewhat in the thalamus. So just saying, hey, do you feel me touching your arm? Yes. They may not be able to tell you where it's at, or they feel like they may tell you their arm feels like it's just a lump of, feels like dead wood, or something like that. But they can't. But they can feel it, but they can't tell you exactly. They don't have that real fine discriminative touch. That's mainly what's happening on that primary motor strip. You actually tend to still have some location of pain. The pain and temperature location, pinprick location that is more processed a little bit more in the association cortices of your, so you may still have some intact location of pain with damage to the primary somatosensory cortex. The thalamus also does more processing of pain as well. So if your thalamus is okay and your secondary association cortices for your somatosensation is okay, then pain location tends to still be intact, you know, and you have still reasonable perception of pain. If you wipe out the thalamus, you know, or most of the fibers in the internal capsule going from the thalamus up, then you might have more trouble with pain. But if the thalamus is okay and the secondary sensory areas are okay, if it's just purely a stroke right on the primary sensory strip, then pain usually isn't as affected. It's usually not a big deal. They usually have okay pain. If you damage sensory association areas, you can have a combination of things depending on what you damage. If you damage this parietal association cortices right here, you can have astereognosis. This is where if you put an object in somebody's hand, they manipulate it, oh, that's a coin, that's a toothpick, that's a whatever. You can have difficulty with that's astereognosis. If you damage the region here of the secondary area, association area of vision, they can have what's called visual agnosia. They are not blind, you know, they can see just fine, yet they can't recognize things. They may have trouble recognizing somebody's face, you know, and putting together a picture of something and helping make meaning of these visual and categorizing visual information in order to know where to send it to the right place to interpret it. So that's visual agnosia. And then auditory, they have the same thing called auditory agnosia, which is if you damage the secondary area, association area of the cortex, that's the same as receptive aphasia. They're not deaf, they can hear it, they may know that's language, sort of, but not really. That secondary association categorizes, so it's hard for them to categorize the sounds at that point, to even send it to Wernicke's area to interpret it. So that's called auditory agnosia. It's like, I can hear you just fine, but I can't tell exactly maybe what this sound is, or the categorizing of this sound, or interpretation or meaning of this sound, okay, that I'm experiencing. Motor planning areas we've talked about. So if you have damage to the motor planning areas, and it could be any of the motor planning areas, are referred to as typically apraxia, is a term to describe where the inability to perform movement despite normal sensation and motor capabilities. So these people are, you do a manual muscle test, they're just fine on a manual muscle test. Sensation is fine, yet tell them to do some automatic movement like brush their teeth, and they can't do it. They can't figure out how to plan the sequence of movements to do the task, or how to use the object appropriately. There's different types of apraxia depending on which region of these motor planning areas that you get, that you damage. So depending on the region, you might have, or how big the lesion is in those motor planning areas, you might have what's called ideational apraxia. Ideational apraxia is where the person has normal, like they sneeze and they, you know, they rub their nose and they move and they look totally coordinated, their sensation is fine, yet you put an object in front of them, you know, you put a tube of toothpaste and a toothbrush, and you say, go ahead and put the toothpaste on the toothbrush. And they'll just look at it and not even be able to get the idea of how to start and how to do that and plan that movement. Even though they've done it a million times before, they look at it, that's ideational. They can't even get the idea of how to, it's hard for them to even initiate and start the movement because they can't even begin to process the plan. That's ideational apraxia. Ideomotor apraxia is they are able to move and start to try to use the object or do the task, but they do it improperly or ineffectively. And it's not because they have any weakness or sensory problems. So in this case, you say, go ahead and put the toothpaste on the toothbrush and brush your teeth. And they pick up the toothbrush and they try to brush the toothpaste with the toothbrush, or they start brushing their hair with the toothbrush. They know how to use it. But they can move it. They're manipulating it and they're trying to do something, but it's not the right plan. So that's ideomotor. So they're doing something motor. They're actually moving and trying to do something with it, but they're using it the wrong way. Okay. You can have weakness too. A lot of times, if you have a stroke that involves premotor and motor planning areas plus the primary, so the person might have some weakness plus some apraxia. And that's where you work with your OT, your speech therapist, to help decide what's weakness, what's apraxia. There's also types of apraxia, like if you affect certain parts of your brain where it might be limited to just dressing. They do a bunch of other things right, but the dressing area of your motor cortex where you remember how to put your pants on is damaged and they can't put on their pants. They try to put it on their head or whatever, put on their clothes backwards, that kind of stuff. Yet everything else they do fine, you know? That's dressing apraxia. So you can actually call it by the functional task, dressing apraxia, grooming ataxia or apraxia. They all fall in this big category of apraxia. Some people have certain damage to this area down in the premotor area down lower can lead to what's called motor perseveration. Is that a person will start a task and they'll just keep doing it over and over. They don't have the turn-off switch. So they'll keep putting the toothpaste on the toothpaste and don't go to the next step. They get stuck and they keep doing it over and over again. I've had people like in stroke patients who like, where I commonly see if they have like, they're doing sit-to-stands. And this is usually when I have a patient who's unsuccessful. They're having trouble figuring out how to do sit-to-stand, and they try it, and then they just keep going, and they keep trying it over and over again, but it's the wrong program, and it's still ineffective, yet they don't modify the program. So I'll go ahead and stand up, and they'll go, oh, and I'll say, you know, hang on, but and then they keep trying to stand up, and I keep trying to get them to kind of stop, analyze the task, change the move, like they'll not notice that they need to scoot up a little further. Yet they'll just keep doing it over and over again until you have to physically say, just chill, stop for a second, let's reset the program. That's motor perseveration. You can also have it for speech. People will say the same thing over and over again sometimes when they have aphasia, motor planning, and they'll say the same, they'll usually get stuck on one word. And oftentimes that one word's a cuss word. So they'll say shit, damn, yes, or something like that. Randy, the guy who was coming in, has some motor perseveration for some of his speech characteristics, and sometimes it would be a cuss word. And then Broca's aphasia is a form of apraxia. Broca's aphasia is expressive aphasia, which we're going to go all into that in detail, is a form of it's speech apraxia. It's apraxia of speech. The muscles are fine. They're not dysarthric even. They don't have maybe they may have no weakness in their face muscles or tongue muscles. They may also, because remember that lesion could extend over to get some of those muscles, but if it's purely in that motor planning area, they can have it totally normal, stick your tongue out, it moves fine, but they still can't produce meaningful speech. They can't put the words together in the right order, the right syllables, that kind of thing. Oh, I'm going to show you a video here of apraxia. Good example of that. Let's hope the sound works.
We will see some of the difficulties which a person may have after a stroke if they have dyspraxia.
Sometimes it's called dyspraxia. And apraxia are the same thing.
And it is the reduced ability to coordinate, perform, plan, or carry out specific movements even when there is no paralysis. If a person has dyspraxia, they may appear to be very clumsy. See how Greg has difficulty with the plug and the electric socket. He also has a problem putting the kettle on its stand.
If he was ataxic, he'd be doing all this. You know, he'd be like, but he's not ataxic. He's not ataxic. He's apraxic. He can't motor plan it. Gets it eventually, but it's really hard for him. kind of trying to figure out what's my next step. What do I need? What kind of... It's slow. It's delayed. It's not totally gone, but he's...
It is clear that he knows what he should be doing, but at times he seems hesitant. For example, when he is choosing the spoon from the drawer, he has to look and feel each piece of cutlery before he chooses the spoon. Help him would be to organize the...
Let's see here. How do I get... There we go. There we go. All right. Back to... Let's say praxia, primary motor cortex. This is what you classically see when we think about hemiparesis, where you've got hemiparesis, contralateral loss, especially fractionation of movement, fine movement. So somebody with a stroke, they might be able to move their shoulder girdle a little bit, and they're moving their hip and leg a little bit, but they have trouble with distal control and function and that voluntary control. This is where also they'll have dysarthria of speech. If you actually affect the facial muscles, tongue muscles, and if the motor planning area, if Broca's area is okay and Wernicke's area is fine, they may be able to know what they want to say, but it just sounds sloppy and difficulty because of weakness in muscles. Prefrontal association cortices, if you damage these prefrontal areas here, we can have loss of executive function, divergent thinking. They can't come up with not motor plans, but just plans for tasks or make decisions. And they also can't do divergent thinking. And they can't, like, if something changes in a task or the plan, how to adapt to it. They have a difficulty adapting to changes in whatever task or thing they're trying to do. But it has minimal effect on standard tests of intelligence, like math calculation skills, memory, things like that. It has not too much of an effect on that. If you damage the parietal association cortices, this area in here, or Wernicke's, you can have Wernicke's aphasia if it's on the left side. If it's on the right side, you're going to have difficulty directing your attention, and you have comprehending space will be difficult. Mainly difficulty towards the left. If it's a right hemispheric lesion, they're going to have more difficulty with the left side of their body or the left side of their environment. It's going to tend to be more impacted by these things of comprehending space and so forth. But they'll generally have problems understanding nonverbal communication. They can. Let's dive into these language disorders that are based on damage to the cerebral cortex and get into those just to make sure you feel good about the language disorders. So Broca's aphasia, that's the first one. This is the expressive aphasia. It's a form of apraxia for your language, okay? It's also known as non-fluent aphasia. You hear that term? Expressive aphasia and motor aphasia. All those things are same as Broca's aphasia, okay? I actually like more of the expressive or motor aphasia. It tends to tell me more than Broca's aphasia. So I like expressive aphasia because you're trying to express yourself. Either using language, that's either verbal or written, okay? You'll often see grammatical omissions and errors. They are aware that they have the problem if they're Wernicke's area. The Wernicke's area, which is back here a little farther, if that's okay, they can tell they're not saying it right, and they get so pissed off and frustrated because they know they know in their head the word they're trying to get out, but it won't come out, and it won't come out right, and they know that they won't come out right because they're able to understand that they're not making sense. And so it's incredibly frustrating for them, for you, and it's always trying to find that balance because you want to you want to challenge them. You don't want to just finish their sentences for them or interpret things, but you also get your therapy done that day. And so I'm always kind of talking to the speech therapist or the patient or their family, like, how can we encourage language but still not get in the way of us getting our physical therapy done, because you're waiting. How many times do you give them a chance to say it and pause and those kind of things? So this is a really cool little video here of a girl who had a stroke and had aphasia, and you'll see two different time points, and people do get better from it. And for example, Randy's made a ton of progress since I'd seen him. He had almost no communication, and now we've actually had days where we've had true conversations where we were able to communicate enough that we could get some decent conversation material going here. So let's watch Sarah. I'm just going to leave it in this format. It's a little easier to...
I think that's a healthy 18-year-old brain. Mine is the other one, 55.
Okay. So what's your name?
Scott. Oh, no. Sarah Scott.
That's right. And how old are you?
I can't.
Try.
I can't.
You're 19. 19.
And you'll notice she's got a piece of paper to try to write it out too. Usually that's affected too, but sometimes one's more affected than the other. Sometimes their speech is more affected, sometimes their writing is more affected, or sometimes they're both affected the same. So it doesn't hurt to try both, and you want to try to see if they can express themselves either way. But
Stroke.
You had a stroke last year.
Yes.
And what happened? Can you remember what happened?
School and English class.
Okay.
And I book and I read it aloud, but I can't because stroke. And so I turn the and
so lots of grammatical omissions and errors.
it's the same as kind of thing as you know.
Pins and needles.
Yeah,
like pins
the
and
same, and also arms, but
leg.
So she's looking at her right arm and right leg, which is means her left side of her brain is being affected
And
during the stroke.
what happened after the stroke with your speech?
but I can't.
You have speech problems.
Yeah.
Do you know what that's called?
Yeah.
I don't know that she doesn't seem like she's writing anything meaningful down. She's trying to, but it's...
I haven't heard you say the...
Okay, now let's watch a later video, an update.
Hello, I'm Sarah Scott. It's another video for me because it's my stroke.
Can you notice the right side of her face is just a little weaker and not as expressive too?
5 years ago.
Especially the lower part of her face?
But it seems like yesterday. So this video, I want to talk about the things that are hard for me. So my reading and my writing. I guess I'll just think about the things that I'm doing now first. So I'm working at a school. The school that I actually went there, and the school that I had my stroke at. So yeah, I really like it there. The people there know about my disability, so the people
It's
there
5 years
are
later.
friendly and understanding. I'm not working there every day, but it's a start.
I think she has a more recent video if you look her up. So I think she's got some more updates since then. So that's Broca's aphasia. And this was actually the brain that Broca dissected. Where somebody who had this pure Broca's aphasia, and you can see that nice hole there from somebody who had a stroke. That's area 44 and 45, Brodmann's area right there, and that's how he kind of discerned that that's Broca's area, when they, after the person died, they could look at that and see where that specific lesion was. Wernicke's aphasia is the receptive. It's also called fluent aphasia, receptive aphasia, or sensory aphasia. Fluent because they just start saying a lot of sounds. They sound fluent, but it's gibberish. Like you're like all this, like they'll start talking, and at first you think they're making sense, and all of a sudden, wait, this is not making sense at all. Because their Broca's area is okay, so they can spit out words. They can spit out lots of words, but the words may not be meaningful. They may not be appropriate for the next word and previous word. And the problem is they have Wernicke's area damage, so they don't know that what they're saying, they can't check themselves. They think they know what they're saying because they can't check and know that they're actually saying gibberish. And so they get mad at you because they'll just start talking. And you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And they're like, and they just start yelling and getting even more strong, and they just get like, why can't people understand me? I know exactly. In their head, they know what they're saying, but they're just not coming out right, because they can't check themselves. Okay, and so, but they also can't understand you, and they're like wondering why you're talking gibberish to them because they can't understand what you're trying to say and make sense of what you're trying to say. So that's Wernicke's aphasia. So that's, I'd rather have somebody. It's easier to actually work with somebody with Broca's aphasia, because you can at least communicate to them and they can understand your directions and they know that they've got a language disorder. People with Wernicke's, they don't know they have a language disorder and they can't understand you, and they just get mad and frustrated, and so it's hard to communicate instructions to them during a therapy session and so forth. The worst is called global aphasia. That's when you have both areas wiped out. Where you have a big stroke that involves both Wernicke's and Broca's area, and that's really a bad, hard one and limits progress and makes it hard for your goals because the person can't speak very well and they can't understand anything. You get just some mild word substitution in mild cases. They seem unaware of their disorder. I got a video here of showing a very pleasant gentleman with Wernicke's aphasia that is just kind of cute to watch for a guy that's had a stroke.
Hi Byron, how are you?
I'm happy. Are you pretty? You look good.
What are you doing today?
We stayed with the water over here at the moment and talked with the people over them over there. They're diving for them at the moment. They'll save in the moment. He'll water very soon for him. With luck. For him.
So we're on a cruise and we're about to
We
get to
will
the
sort right here and they'll save their hands right there for them.
So he sounds very fluent, you know.
Right at the moment they don't show a darn thing.
With the iPad that we were doing. Like here?
I'd like my change for me and change hands for me. With happy. I would talk with Donna sometimes. We're out with them. Other people are working with them. Very happy with them. This girl was really good. And happy. And I play golf. And hit other trees. And play out with the hands.
So sometimes you can pick up a few things he's trying to.
Hold for people's thoughts. Their hands. I don't know what you get, but I talk with a lot of hand for hand. Sometimes. I talk with any more to say it.
All right, thank you very much.
So that's fluent aphasia, Wernicke's receptive aphasia. It's also true for them trying to read things. Okay, so the reading part of that. Yeah. What's that? Yeah.
So if, like in the Broca's, how it was written and she like still couldn't really understand it, Wernicke's, like if you write something to them, can they interpret that?
No.
Okay.
But sometimes they can. It's worth trying. It's worth trying to see if they can interpret. Yeah. She was just writing. She was making symbols or writing, but I don't think we could have read it. You know, she knew what she was trying to say and what she was trying to write, but it wasn't probably coming out correctly. But here they would have difficulty reading it, which is called alexia. Alexia is a difficulty with understanding written language. Agraphia is the difficulty, right? So typically people with Broca's aphasia have agraphia with it, some level of agraphia. With Wernicke's, it's just some form of alexia where they have difficulty reading, comprehending written language. But you just try it. See, hey, does the written versus the verbal, what works better for them? So, yeah.
Are you able to make similar progress with the Wernicke's?
It just depends how severe it is. To me, that can slow things down with the Wernicke's. So a lot of that is just like you're doing a lot of body language. Let's get up. Let's go for a walk. We're going to do sit to stands. And you're trying to show them a lot of things of what to do. And then if you're going to give them any instructions, a lot of times pictures work better. You know, like some kind of a picture of without a lot of language on it works better for people with Wernicke's aphasia. However, people with damage to the right side of their brain maybe don't do as well with pictures. You want to give them stuff with written instructions, and they may still have some pictures, but they may not be able to interpret the pictures very well because they don't understand visual spatial relationships as much. So. It's still gibberish. They'll be able to write. They'll write all kinds of words, but it would be kind of like their speech. Yeah. So that's a good clarification to make. There's a type of aphasia called conduction aphasia. There's damage to that arcuate fasciculus that connects those areas. So these people tend to have normal ability to understand language. They still have some difficulty producing meaningful speech, especially when they're trying to repeat things or when they're communicating with another person. If they're just expressing a novel thought or idea in speech, they can do that because their Broca's area is okay. It's when they have to listen to somebody say, hey, repeat after me, say the word flower. They can't get that information from Wernicke's area back to Broca's area to repeat the word flower. And even in order to have a conversation, you have to send the signal from Wernicke's to your Broca's area to respond. So they have a hard time with conversational speech and repetition, repeating something, but just saying out loud a novel thought, you know, and telling you something, they can still do that because Broca's area is okay. That's called conduction aphasia. Not conduction of hearing, it's conduction of that arcuate fasciculus between Wernicke's and Broca's area. Then global aphasia is that more severe form of aphasia that cannot produce or understand language. So this is that, you know, this is Wernicke's area, although Wernicke's area is really more up here. This is the secondary, so this picture's not the best. But anyway, Wernicke's area is here. This is the arcuate fasciculus. So a conduction aphasia is where you have a stroke that involves a branch, usually the middle cerebral artery, that impacts those white matter tracts that are connecting those two. Global aphasia is usually a big middle cerebral artery stroke that affects, you know, it's a primary, it affects the primary branch of the middle cerebral artery as it goes to supply the whole lateral part of their cerebrum. So these people often have a lot of profound hemiparesis, sensory loss, plus if it's on the left side, it's big, a lot of language deficits. Those are just harder patients to get better. This is the terms I mentioned before. Alexia is inability to comprehend written language, which is associated with Wernicke's aphasia, and agraphia is inability to write, associated with Broca's aphasia. We're just going to keep, we're almost done with this, right? So you guys okay with this, get through this? Okay. Neglect. Some people tend to have neglect. This tendency to behave as if one side of the body and or your environment doesn't exist, you know? So they're just neglectful of either their own body or the environment on that one side. It's usually associated most commonly with right parietal. Your right parietal lobe is where you do a lot of processing of body and space, spatial awareness, body language, all that kind of stuff is more in the right parietal association area. So you have a stroke up there, you will tend to have some form of neglect. You can have personal neglect, which is called hemi-attention. So hemi-inattention is you neglect the whole side of your body. So I've had instances where a person had a right-sided stroke. In that parietal association cortices, they just knocked that out, plus some profound hemiparesis on this side. Like literally they can't move their left side of their body, yet they think that they're just fine. And they actually, it can be so bad that they think that and this is where we get into the term anosognosia, where they actually deny the disability. They deny that this side of their body is theirs, that they actually think it's somebody else's body. And so you could actually take their arm, put it in front of their face, and say, "This is your arm." And they're like, "No, that's somebody else's. If that arm would just get out of my way, I'd be able to get up and get out of this bed." They literally think like the leg there is tripping. Like I've had patients, this leg keeps tripping. Somebody's leg keeps tripping me when I try to get up. They think it's somebody else's leg tripping them. And if it wasn't for that, they just get walk out of this hospital. So you're spending half your therapy session trying to convince them they actually have a problem and showing them their limbs. You can put a mirror in front of them, and sometimes they don't recognize that that's their side of the body. It can be that severe. So it's very. I've only seen 2 cases where it was that profound, where I'm just like having to convince them the whole therapy. And those are the ones you got to be careful, because they'll just do crazy stuff and just try to stand up and walk out on you in the middle of a therapy session and just fall on the floor because they think they're fine, you know. And then they'll go, "Dang, that person tripped me again," you know. It's crazy. Or they're, you know, the arm is dangling in the wheelchair, you know, as they're trying to go down, it's catching in the spokes, and they're like, "This damn arm, somebody keeps sticking their arm in my wheelchair and keeps getting in the way of my," you know, crazy. We mentioned lateral pulsion, which is also known as that controversive pusher syndrome. They tend to push from the left paretic side towards the paretic side, so they tend to push themselves towards their paretic side. It tends to be with thalamic lesions, especially the posterior thalamus, or the vestibular nuclei. So sometimes the brainstem lesions in the vestibular nucleus can lead to lateral pulsion. Let's see, here's an example video. So he's falling towards his left side, so he's got a right-sided lesion, probably in the posterior thalamus. So he's trying to show him to shift to the right. He would be best not to touch his left side, because if you touch their left side, like he's putting on his neck there, I would not do that. I would keep all the contacts on the right side. You don't want to give them something to push into, because if you give them something to push into, they're going to push. And I'd actually set him, so this therapist doing everything I wouldn't do. I would not, he's trying to get him to lean to that side. He's giving him this arm, though, to actually lean onto. I would not give him that arm to lean onto while he does that, because he might push with it, you know. If I did, I would make him go all the way down on his elbow, because then you can't really, it's hard to push up from your elbow. So it's not wrong, per se. As long as the person responds to this and doesn't push with it, then you might have to cue him. And I might disadvantage that right leg. If he's pushing with that right leg to try to push himself over, we might put it up on a ball or something, or put it so it can't push off a firm surface, you know. So then, and then maybe he has to bear weight through the left side more, through that leg, but not be able to push with the right side. I wouldn't walk away from that guy. That's the other thing I would not do there. He just failed that practical. But what this guy's, you'll notice what this guy's doing. Look at his fingers. He's got them wrapped underneath he's basically keeping himself, he's trying to pull himself versus push himself over. So he's actually holding himself, he's leaning against that arm kind of, and I would not let him grab underneath the edge of that table like that, because that's counterproductive as well. So. Never leave a pusher alone. Just he at least does have his foot up off the ground. He can't push very effectively with that foot because he's got that table high enough. Of course, now he's going to lower it, which is, I guess, is okay. You want to at least have equal weight bearing. You just don't want to give them too much of an advantage with that right. But that looks better. He's starting to go to the right or to the left. Oh, there he goes. There he goes. So that's an example. So those are all things you can see with cerebral deficits, cerebral impact. Good. We got that done. We got you out early.